Welcome to the Begley Library tutorial on primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. If at any point you need assistance or have a question, please do not hesitate to contact a librarian. In order for primary, secondary, and tertiary sources to make sense, you need to put it in the context of a scholarly communication. In other words, the ongoing conversation about a topic among experts that takes place in the form of research articles, books, and conference presentations. As a student, it is a fact of life that when you complete an assignment like a research paper or presentation, the obvious audience is your instructor and possibly also your fellow students. The usual purpose is to learn and to demonstrate what you have learned, both in terms of the subject matter of the course and in terms of becoming a better critical thinker and a better writer and presenter. But your assignments also have a second audience and purpose. If your instructor tells you to create an advertisement for a hypothetical product, your second audience is the audience of your ad, and your second purpose is to convince those people that their life will be better if they buy your product. The same thing with a research paper or presentation assignment. Your second audience is the scholarly community for your topic. Having that audience allows you to make certain assumptions about the kind of language you will use and what things you can safely talk about without explaining. Your second purpose is to participate in this scholarly conversation about your topic. You are picking up the thread of conversation that you found by reading scholarly articles and books, and you are adding to it with your own findings, ideas, and interpretations. Perhaps you have a new fact to add, or maybe you found a mistake in someone else's work. Whatever it is, the whole point of it is that you're not just absorbing the information out there and writing it down in your own words. You're adding something new to the existing body of knowledge and the collective understanding. Many of us went through school being taught that knowledge is a huge set of facts and skills that we acquire. In a very basic way, that is true for memorizing multiplication tables and spelling and history, names, and dates. But it is very flawed. This model of education falls apart as soon as you get to subjects that require creativity and critical thinking, which is almost everything that is useful in the real world. When you learn, you are creating knowledge in your own mind. It isn't coming from the outside. You are picking up the data and the patterns, putting them together with the concepts you already have, and constructing new pathways in your mind. This doesn't happen in a vacuum. Although the pathways in your mind are yours alone, and your interpretation is as unique as your fingerprint, you are immersed in a social world. There is scholarly language and subculture, and an even narrower, more specific language and subculture for your subject area. Part of college education is being immersed in the language and subculture for your subject area and getting used to participating in it. The way you participate in scholarly culture and scholarly communication is by reading articles and books and watching and listening to presentations on the one hand, and by responding to them with your own ideas on the other. Say Smith writes an article on the flocking behavior of pigeons and says that pigeon flocks follow a leader. Jones disagrees and promptly does some new research and comes up with what Jones says is proof that Smith's theory is wrong, and in fact, pigeons flock by consensus. Gomez thinks Smith and Jones each have some good points, and writes up a research study demonstrating that while pigeons do flock more or less by consensus, some individual pigeons have more influence on the outcome of the consensus than others. And it goes on indefinitely. As a student, your job is to jump right into that ongoing debate, learn what people know or think they know about a subject, learn what the controversies are, and learn enough that you have something to say on one side or the other. It may be a long time before you are knowledgeable and experienced enough for one of your articles to get through peer review, and publishing scholarly articles probably isn't what you want out of life anyway. But understanding that is your goal as a college student, at least in theory, can help you understand some of the seemingly arbitrary rules about how you do college research and writing. All right, now I can talk about primary, secondary, and tertiary sources and have it make sense. I said that scholarly communication is an ongoing, multi-threaded debate about a topic. There are rules for the discussion, and they basically amount to requiring all your arguments to be based on evidence and reason. Primary sources are your evidence. Secondary sources interpret the evidence and provide the reasons that back up the interpretation. Tertiary sources are teaching and learning tools that summarize a topic. As a student and a scholar, you are a reader or listener and writer or presenter of all three primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. First, let's talk about you as a consumer of knowledge. When you want to research a company's performance, you go to the annual reports and SEC filings. When you want to research the behavior of sunspots, you go to NASA's photographs and data sets. Those are primary sources. But you can't write a paper based solely on data sets. You can't know if you have something new and useful to contribute to the conversation until you've read what other people are saying. You can't be sure of your interpretations until you've assessed the strengths and weaknesses of other interpretations. That's when you go to the secondary sources, other scholars, books, articles, and conference presentations about your topic. Maybe I'm putting the cart before the horse. You are a beginner in this subject area, and scholarly articles are full of technical language and complicated concepts. You need some entry-level reading, and that's where tertiary sources come in. You can start with the textbook for your course, and you can also get encyclopedias and handbooks and other kinds of reference books from the library and online. You can consult them for facts and figures, and you can rely on them to provide a good summary or overview of what you're interested in. As I've been saying all along, you're not just a consumer of knowledge, you're also creating it. Whenever you do an experiment and gather data, or observe a phenomenon and take notes, whenever you interview someone for an oral history or record an event, you are creating a primary source. When you write a research paper based on the evidence from primary sources plus your own ideas, then you're creating a secondary source. And whenever you do another kind of assignment where you summarize, reflect on, or critique some articles or books, you are creating a tertiary source. By now, you've probably arrived at what librarians usually tell students at the beginning. Primary sources are the closest to the source. They're first-hand accounts, direct and indirect evidence, recordings, and things like that. Secondary sources are one step away from that, and tertiary sources are one more step removed. Is there such a thing as another step out? That would be called a quaternary source. Of course they exist. Any middle school students who write an essay based on an encyclopedia article are creating a quaternary source. But apart from the reading and writing practice, the value of such a source is questionable. The next thing I want to do is provide some concrete examples of different kinds of primary sources. One obvious kind of primary source is an interview or oral history taken from a person who witnessed or was involved in an event or phenomenon. Historians use oral histories to learn about relatively recent history. Anthropologists, psychologists, and sociologists depend on interviews for data. Marketing researchers also use interviews and focus groups. Another kind of primary source is the notes, data sets, and recordings taken from experiments and observations. These are practically the only kind of primary sources used in math and the hard sciences. They also predominate in the harder social sciences like economics and many fields of psychology. They are used along with other kinds of primary sources in all the other social sciences and even in some methods of studying history. Intellectual and cultural history, art history, culture studies, and to some extent anthropology and sociology depend on specimens of art from certain times, places, and segments of society in order to study that society. This can be literature, visual arts, architecture, music, theater, dance, and even fashion. Here is a dilemma. It's obvious that a video of British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's speech is a primary source, but audio-video recordings are a relatively recent invention. Abraham Lincoln's speeches were recorded in writing, a medium that leaves a lot of room for the person doing the recording to put their own slant on things. And yet, written transcripts of speeches are still primary sources. They are evidence, but some evidence is more reliable than other. The same kind of thing applies to the picture of George Washington crossing the Delaware River. There were no cameras at the time, and this is what we have for historical documentation. It's obviously an artist's interpretation, not even attempting to be photorealistic. What can be gathered from it as historical fact, and what can be learned from it about how the artist and his contemporaries viewed the event? Another kind of primary source is personal communications like diaries, letters, and notebooks. These are first-hand accounts by eyewitnesses or participants in an event or phenomenon. But as a researcher, you need to take into account that they were written for one audience and purpose and context, and you are using them for something very different. When you read personal documents as primary sources, take into account things like the culture and background of the person writing them. Also consider they assumed they were in private, so they might not accurately represent the dominant ways of thinking of their time and place. For example, two lovers might write about running away together, which doesn't necessarily mean it was something that they'd be able or willing to do in real life. Learn as much as you can about what their everyday life would have been like and use that to contextualize their words. One final kind of primary source that I'll mention is reports. These days, reports are often available online on the websites of governmental agencies, nonprofit organizations, and corporations. They will report on their own gains and losses, successes and failures, personnel and policies. They'll also report on topics of interest to themselves and the field of activity. For example, the United Nations issues reports on everything from the world's water supply to the status of women to international conflicts. NASA has reports on climate as well as astronomy. Think tanks produce reports on the economy and social issues. Just as you have to be careful interpreting primary sources written by individuals, these reports may be a rich source of data, but they can also be spin-doctored. A company's annual report may have to report losses, but even ethical companies gloss over negative things and put them in a better light. A report on unemployment from a conservative think tank and one from a liberal think tank may have used different research methods and have completely different numbers. What I am trying to say is that while primary sources are used for evidence and research, that doesn't mean they are objective. Even raw numbers aren't necessarily objective because you have to look at how those numbers were obtained. Scholarly journal articles and scholarly books are usually secondary sources. They use the primary sources as evidence. They also refer to other secondary sources for context and to back up their points. Some popular magazine articles and nonfiction books are also secondary sources for the same reasons. Others are less clear. Most news and news magazine articles about new research are actually just summaries of the research studies, so that makes them more like a tertiary source. Depending on what your instructor wants, you might still be able to use them. On the other hand, it might be a better idea to find the scholarly article that it's based on and read that. Quality documentaries are usually secondary sources. Tertiary sources are just as straightforward. Your textbooks are tertiary sources. Textbooks are produced specifically to guide a student who is taking a course through the content that the course covers. They are not based on original research. Instead, they summarize and synthesize content from secondary sources in a way that's designed to help the student digest it. Because they are based on secondary sources, they are tertiary sources. Reference books, like encyclopedias, handbooks, manuals, guides, and so forth, are the same. They're written to serve as a compendium of facts and figures or an overview of a topic. They are not original research, but are based on the original research of multiple scholars, so that's what makes them tertiary. There is one exception. In any reference database or reference collection of a physical library, you'll find some books that are compilations of selected primary sources, like the American Decades series, or one of those huge art books where you can look at individual paintings. Those are used as primary sources, even though they're in the same section with the tertiary sources. A question we often get is where to find primary sources. Fortunately, they are all over the place. If you are able to travel, you can find them in the Special Collections Room of Libraries, in historical societies, and in archives. You may also find primary sources through your own legwork by interviewing people involved in something, conducting experiments or observations, or discovering collections of documents, artifacts, and ephemera. Finally, the internet is a great place to get primary sources. All those libraries, archives, museums, and historical societies that I mentioned are digitizing their collections as fast as they can. All the public domain content and all the content they hold the rights to is right out there for anyone to access. All you have to do is enter your topic into a search engine along with the phrase primary sources, and chances are you'll find something. You can also find primary sources on the library's website by clicking on the Research tab, then on Find Articles, then on Library Databases, and then at the top of the screen, click where it says All Content Types and select Primary Source Material. This will provide you a list of databases that contain either all primary sources or primary sources mixed in with other content. So that's it for primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. The most important thing to remember is that the reason you want primary sources is that they're closest to the original source of information. If at any point you need assistance or have a question, please do not hesitate to contact a librarian.